like you said, we can probably get through the lengthened partials component of the result pretty quickly, because there is basically no difference between them. Um, Strictly speaking, and I'll get the technical bit out of the way. We actually set this up, to use the kind of technical terminology, as a very, very severe statistical test of the hypothesis that there would be no meaningful difference between the two conditions. So we went in actually hypothesizing that there wouldn't be a difference. And then we specifically set up our statistical analysis to test that. Whereas normally most studies you see will test to see if there is a difference. And then if they can't reject the null hypothesis that there is no difference, they'll conclude the same, which technically isn't accurate. And I mean, we've done that before in the past, before I knew any better. But we specifically set up to essentially test what would be called statistical equivalence between the two. But we also really set very, very stringent statistical inference criteria. So typically, I mean, most people will have heard of the kind of, if your p-value is less than 0.05, then it's quote unquote statistically significant. And that is p-value is essentially related to the error rates at which we want to control making like false positive claims, or what we call type 1 error. So, for example, if there really was no difference between, or in our case, if there really was a difference between the two interventions, if we had everything set up and statistically powered to test and maintain that 0.5 error rate, we would only, if we ran the study over and over and over again, only 5% of the time will we incorrectly conclude there's a difference when actually there is no difference. But we actually set our criteria even more stringent than that. We set it at 0.01, and actually adjusted it between the two hypertrophy outcomes because we had both arm and thigh. And so with that very, very stringent criteria, technically our p-value was just above the threshold. So technically our conclusion should be we're not quite sure whether they are statistically equivalent at our very, very strict level of criteria. But if you take a step back and then you use the criteria that the rest of the field accepts as acceptable levels of evidence, there is definitely no difference between the two, given that. And in fact, when we look at the actual estimates of the effect, so we use what are called standardized estimates for this. And what that does is essentially it looks at the changes or the difference in changes between the two interventions in standard deviation units, which is typically what you might see if you looked at a meta-analysis where all the data is pulled from different studies. Typically, you'll see a standardized mean effect, and that will be in standard deviation. So the reason we did that is because it makes it a lot more comparable to previous big analyses we've done in terms of big meta-analyses, which we talked about on the podcast before, things like the standardized estimates from our FIT20 data set in terms of strength. And so it makes it more comparable for us.